The sun had barely risen above the jagged rim of the Arizona desert when the sound of the wind carried something strange across the red sand. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the shuffle of a coyote's paws. It was the faint rattle of chains. It's the kind of sound that didn't belong to the desert, but to men who'd been broken or bound. She froze when she heard it. Her breath caught halfway in her chest, the morning light glinting off the silver buckle that barely held her torn belt together. Her dress, once pale blue, was now a shade of dust and sweat. She'd been walking for hours, maybe days. It was hard to tell time out there when the world was nothing but heat and silence. Her name was Ruth, and she was 7 months pregnant. Her husband was going to lost somewhere beyond the mesas, perhaps dead, perhaps worse. The desert had a way of swallowing men whole, and she had seen enough graves under the mesquite to know it didn't care for prayers or promises, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after what she'd seen back at the trading post. Not after the blood. The air felt heavier that morning. Even the ravens circling overhead were quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She followed the sound until she reached a narrow wash where the rocks formed a kind of shelter. That's when she saw him. He was sitting on the ground, slumped against a cedar trunk. His hands were bound in front of him, his eyes covered with a strip of rawhide tied tight enough to leave marks across his temples. His long hair fell over his shoulders, black and tangled. His chest was marked with faint scars, old battles, maybe, or punishments. He wasn't dead, not yet. His chest rose and fell, slow and steady. Ruth stepped closer, her boots crunching softly on the dry ground. The man didn't move. For a long while, she just stood there, unsure if she was looking at a victim or a trap. She had heard stories about the Apache, stories whispered by wagon men and traders who claimed they moved, like shadows, and struck without warning. Yet this man didn't look like a hunter. He looked broken. She lowered her canteen, hesitated, then uncorked it. The smell of warm metal filled the air as she poured a trickle of water over his cracked lips. His head moved just slightly. Then a low sound came from his throat, rough and hoarse. "Why help me?" he whispered. The question startled her more than any shout could have. She couldn't answer right away. Maybe it was because she hadn't spoken to another soul in days. Maybe it was because she didn't know herself. She knew was that she couldn't walk away from him. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Maybe because no one helped me either. The man didn't respond, but something in his stillness shifted. Ruth cut the rawhide around his wrists, then carefully loosened the strip over his eyes. When the leather fell away, she saw the truth. His eyes were open, but they were white, milky, and distant. Blind. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the horizon. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed. The Apache turned his face toward the sound, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. "They'll come back. Who will?" she asked. He didn't answer. His hand brushed the dirt beside him, searching until he found a small pouch tied to his belt. He opened it and took out a feather bound with a strip of sinew. He held it as though it were something sacred. "They took me while I was sleeping," he said. "Men who wear crosses on their chests and drink from silver flasks. They wanted me to lead them across the mountain. I refused." Ruth's stomach twisted. She knew the kind of men he meant: mercenaries, bounty hunters, the kind who would kill for gold and call it justice. She'd seen them before near Fort Buchanan, riding under the flag of law, but living by their own rules. "They'll kill you for helping me," he said, his voice low and calm. "Should leave before they see your tracks." Ruth glanced at the horizon. The sun was higher now, burning against her back. Her canteen was half empty, her feet blistered, and the child inside her kicked restlessly, as if sensing the fear tightening her chest. But she couldn't go back. Not with the post in ashes, not with the men who'd done it still alive. "They killed my husband," she said. "They burned everything. If they're coming for you too, maybe we're better off together." For a moment, he seemed to listen to her breathing, measuring her words. Then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Then you must learn to move without being seen," he said, "because they are already hunting." Her pulse quickened. She turned toward the sound of the wind again, and that's when she saw a flicker of movement far out on the plain. 3 riders, dark against the light. Their horses kicked up long trails of dust that shimmered like smoke. Ruth's throat went dry. "They're close," she whispered. The Apache tilted his head again. "They brought dogs," he said softly. "We have little time." He rose unsteadily, his legs weak from days of being bound. Ruth reached out to steady him, and he allowed her hand on his arm. His skin was warm, scarred, and solid. She felt a strange current of strength beneath his exhaustion. Together they began to climb toward the ridge, each step leaving faint marks in the sand that the wind tried to erase. Behind them, the riders grew closer. The sound of barking carried through the canyon, sharp and angry. Ruth's heart pounded against her ribs. She tried to keep pace, but the weight of her child pressed against her spine, slowing her every move. The Apache seemed to sense it. "Give me your hand," he said. "Follow my steps. The wind will hide our scent." She did as he told her, trusting a blind man more than she'd ever trusted the sighted. They moved through a narrow cut in the rock, following a hidden trail that wound up toward the mountains. The path was steep, but shaded. For the first time all morning, she felt a hint of cool air. When they reached a ledge overlooking the desert floor, Ruth turned back. The riders were closer now. She could see the glint of their rifles catching the sun. One of them dismounted, kneeling to examine the ground. He shouted something, pointing toward the wash where the Apache had been tied. "They found where you were," she said. He nodded. "They will follow. But the desert hides those who respect it." His words held something she didn't understand, a belief in the land itself, as if it were alive and watching. Ruth looked out over the endless expanse of sand and stone, and for the first time she felt its pulse. Every shadow, every gust of wind, seemed to move with purpose. The Apache turned his face toward the sound of the distant riders again. "They won't stop," he said. "They think I carry something that belongs to them. But what they want can't be owned." "What is it?" she asked. He turned his blind eyes toward her, and for a moment she could have sworn he saw her clearly. "The truth," he said. "The truth always draws blood." A low rumble echoed across the canyon, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A puff of dust burst near their feet. Ruth gasped, instinctively crouching low. The Apache didn't flinch. "They found us," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Now the desert will decide who it keeps." Another shot rang out, closer this time. The echo bounced off the cliffs like thunder. Ruth grabbed his arm. "What do we do?" He lifted his head toward the sky, the feather still clutched in his hand. "We run toward the storm," he said. "Because the men who hunt us fear what they cannot see." The wind rose again, swirling dust and grit into the air. The riders shouted from below, spurring their horses up the slope. Ruth took one last look behind her before following the blind Apache into the maze of stone and wind. Her heart pounding with fear and something else, hope, fragile and fierce. The desert swallowed their tracks as the storm gathered on the horizon, and in that rising roar of wind and thunder, the hunt began. The wind screamed across the rocks as Ruth followed the Apache deeper into the canyon, her skirt torn and boots scraping against the rough stone. Dust stung her eyes, and each breath burned her throat. The storm was gathering fast, the sky shifting from gold to bruised gray. Lightning flickered somewhere beyond the mesas, far enough not to strike but close enough to warn. Behind them the riders' shouts faded for a while, muffled by the rising wind. For a fleeting moment she thought maybe they had lost them. The Apache moved with strange certainty, even blind. His steps were quiet and sure, his hand grazing the wall of the canyon as though he could read the land by touch alone. Ruth watched him, amazed at how the storm didn't slow him down. He seemed to know every bend and hollow, like someone guided by something older than sight. When the wind grew too strong, he reached back for her hand, pulling her toward a crevice barely visible in the rock. "Here," he said. "We wait." The space was narrow, but deep enough to shield them from the dust. Ruth pressed her back against the cool stone, clutching her belly as her child kicked restlessly. She could taste the dryness in her mouth, the coppery temps with fear mixed with grit. "You knew this storm would come," she said quietly. He nodded, his face calm beneath streaks of dirt. "The desert always speaks before it strikes. You just have to listen." His words settled heavy in the small space. She studied him, the scars across his arms, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he seemed both grounded and somewhere far away. He didn't act like a prisoner or a man on the run. There was a steadiness about him that didn't belong to fear. "Those men," she said after a long pause. "They wanted something from you? What is it?" The Apache tilted his head slightly, as if weighing how much to tell her. "They came to my village months ago," he said. "Said they were government men, carried papers with seals and badges, promised to pay for safe passage through the mountains. My people refused. We do not guide outsiders across land that holds the bones of our ancestors." Ruth nodded, knowing enough about how promises turned sour out here. "And they didn't take kindly to that." "They never do," he replied softly. "They burned what they couldn't take, took what they thought had value." His hand tightened slightly around the feather he still carried. It looked ordinary, just a small hawk feather bound with a leather cord, but the way he held it told her it meant something. "They said I stole from them," he went on, "but it was they who stole from the dead. They took something sacred, something that does not belong to any man. I tried to stop them, and they bound me for it." The wind howled louder, sweeping grit into the air like a warning. Ruth felt a chill crawl down her spine. "And now they're hunting you to take it back?" The Apache nodded once. "They think it will bring them luck, but the desert curses those who steal from its heart." For a moment, silence fell between them again. Ruth thought of the burned trading post, the smell of smoke still clinging to her memory. She could still see the way the sky turned black that night, the flicker of torches moving like ghosts through the smoke. Her husband had gone out to reason with the men, to beg for mercy, but all she found of him later was his hat in the sand. She swallowed hard and looked at the Apache. "I've seen what men like that do. They don't stop until they have what they want. They don't leave anyone behind." He didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, a dog barked. The sound was faint, carried by the wind, but close enough to send Ruth's pulse racing. "They're still on us," she whispered. "They will be until the sun dies," he said. "But the land will slow them if we move before dawn." Ruth glanced out through the narrow opening of the crevice. The storm was thick now, blurring everything into a haze of sand and shadows. "Where will we go?" "It's to higher ground," he said. "There's water near the mountain edge, in a place where the wind cannot reach." She nodded slowly, though she didn't fully believe it. The desert had a cruel way of offering hope just before it took it away. Still, something in his voice steadied her a quiet strength that made her want to trust him. When the wind began to fade, he motioned for her to follow. The world outside was strange, half buried under drifting sand. The riders' tracks were gone, erased by the storm. Only the faint outline of distant hills broke the horizon. They moved in silence for a long time. Ruth's body ached, her steps slower with every mile. The Apache guided her through dry ravines and rocky paths, always listening, always feeling the air around them. Once they passed the remains of an old wagon, its wheels cracked and half sunk into the sand. Rusted tools and scraps of cloth littered the ground. She stopped for a moment, staring at it. "I think I've seen this place before," she murmured. The Apache turned his face toward her. "You have. The road once led to a river. But the river changed its course years ago. The land remembers what men forget. They camped near a cluster of boulders as night began to fall. The sky turned violet and the first stars appeared, faint but sharp. Ruth built a small fire from what little dry wood she could find. Its light flickered against the Apache's face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his blind gaze fixed somewhere far away. Ruth watched him for a long time before speaking. "You said they took something sacred," she said. "What was it?" He touched the feather at his chest. "It belonged to a medicine man," he said, "a healer who spoke to the spirits of the mountain. The men who burned my village took his relics, things they couldn't understand. His feather is all that's left." Ruth stared into the fire. "And they think it's worth killing for." "They think everything has a price," he said. "Gold, land, even the dead. But some things are not meant to be owned." His words carried a weight she couldn't quite name. She thought of her husband again, of the life they'd tried to build on land that never belonged to them either. The settlers, the traders, the soldiers, they all came chasing the same dream, and the desert buried most of them. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Ruth stood quickly, her hand on her belly. "Do you smell that?" The Apache lifted his head. His nostrils flared slightly. "Yes," he said, "they are burning sagebrush." Masks the smell of their horses. They are close. Her heart pounded. What do we do? He reached for his bow, which she hadn't noticed until now, a simple weapon carved from desert wood. He ran his fingers along the string, testing its tension. We move toward the cliffs, he said. I cannot ride there. Ruth stamped out the fire and followed him into the darkness. The moon was rising, pale and distant, casting the rocks in silver light. Every sound, the rustle of wind, the crunch of her boots seemed too loud. They climbed until the ground dropped away into a deep ravine. The Apache stopped suddenly, crouching low. Ruth followed his gaze and saw faint flickers of light bellow torches moving through the canyon. The men were closer than she thought. She could hear them now, their voices echoing up the rocks. One of them shouted orders, his tone sharp and confident. Another laughed, a low, cruel sound that made her skin crawl. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their presence, hunters closing in. The Apache leaned toward her, his voice barely a whisper. They know we're near. But they don't know how far. Ruth nodded, pressing her hand against her belly. The baby kicked again, restless, as if sensing the danger. Why not leave the feather? She whispered. If that's what they want, maybe they'll stop. He turned toward her, his blind eyes steady. If I give it to them, the land dies a little more. The spirits turn their backs. You cannot buy peace with what is sacred. Below them, the torchlight spread wider. The riders dismounted, their figures moving through the canyon floor. One of them raised a rifle. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. They're aiming this way. The Apache stood slowly, his posture tall and unafraid. Let them come, he said. The mountain knows who it belongs to. The first shot cracked through the night, striking the rock beside them and sending chips of stone into the air. Ruth ducked, clutching her head. Another shot followed, then another. The Apache pulled her toward the edge of the ravine. There's a passage below, he said. It leads into the heart of the mountain. Ruth looked down at the dark opening in the rock. Are you sure it's safe? He gave the faintest smile. Nothing out here is safe, but it's the only way to live. The sound of hooves and shouting filled the air again. Ruth hesitated only a moment before gripping his arm. Together, they descended into the darkness. The roar of the storm, now far behind them, replaced by the echoing heartbeat of the mountain itself. The hunters' torches flickered at the edge of the ravine, their voices rising in anger and confusion. But by then, Ruth and the Apache were gone, swallowed by the earth into a world of shadows, secrets, and a past neither of them could yet escape. The air inside the mountain was cold and thick with dust. Ruth had to bend low to follow the Apache through the narrow passage, her fingers brushing the damp walls for balance. The light from the outside world faded quickly behind them until all that was left was the faint orange glow of a torch he'd lit with a spark from his flint. The shadows danced over the stone, revealing faint carvings that looked older than time spirals, handprints, and symbols she couldn't read. The Apache moved silently, each step measured, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening to the stone itself. His calm unnerved her. The deeper they went, the more she felt the air shift, as if the mountain were breathing around them. Every sound, the drip of water, the shuffle of gravel, echoed like whispers. How did you know about this place? Ruth asked quietly. My people have walked these paths for generations, he said. When the soldiers came, we hid here. The mountain kept us alive. She looked around, running her hand along the rough wall. Are there more tunnels? Many, he replied. Some lead to the river, some to the desert, and some to places no man returns from.
Yes.
We take only the paths the mountain allows. Ruth didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't ask again. The thought of being lost down here with no light was enough to make her chest tighten. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the faint warmth of the torch, on the steady sound of his footsteps ahead. After a while, the tunnel opened into a wide chamber where the ceiling disappeared into darkness. In the center was a small pool of still water, its surface reflecting the torchlight like glass. The Apache knelt beside it and cupped his hands to drink. Ruth followed, kneeling beside him. The water was cool, tasting faintly of minerals. It soothed the dryness in her throat. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the feather again, laying it carefully beside the water. Then he murmured something in a language she didn't understand. His voice was soft, rhythmic, like a prayer or a promise. What are you saying? She asked. I thank the land for shelter, he said simply, and ask it to hide us a little longer. Ruth didn't know if she believed in that kind of thing. But the way he spoke made her wonder if maybe the land really did listen to him. The firelight flickered across his face, casting long shadows that made him look almost otherworldly. "Will they follow us here?" she asked. "They will try," he said. "But the mountain has ways of confusing those who don't belong." He stood then, turning toward a smaller passage that branched off the chamber. "We can rest for a while, but not for long." Ruth settled against a rock, wrapping her shawl tighter. Her body ached from the climb and the weight she carried. She placed her hand over her stomach, feeling the faint movements beneath her skin. The baby had been restless ever since the storm. "Do you have family?" she asked softly. "I did," he said after a moment, "before they came." He didn't say more, and she didn't press. The silence between them felt heavy, but not cold. It was the kind of silence that held understanding, two people bound by loss neither could change. As the night deepened, Ruth drifted in and out of sleep. She dreamt of fire again, of the trading post in flames, of her husband shouting her name before everything went black. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears, and the Apache was gone. Panic surged through her chest until she saw the faint glow of his torch near the far wall. He was kneeling again, his hand pressed against the stone as though he were feeling for something. "They're close," he said without turning. "The dogs are near the outer entrance. We need to move before they find the trail." Ruth's heart pounded. "How can you tell?" "The earth carries sound," he said. "The dogs' feet, the horses, the men they shake the stone." She gathered her things quickly, and together they moved deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the path steeper. At one point Ruth slipped on loose gravel, catching herself against the wall. The Apache turned immediately, reaching out to steady her. "You must be careful," he said. "The mountain punishes haste." She nodded, breathing hard. "It's just... the air feels strange down here. It remembers," he said quietly. Every scream, every secret, every step taken in fear. His words sent a shiver through her. She tried not to imagine what else might be buried in the dark. After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to rise again. Faint light filtered through cracks ahead. When they emerged, it was near dawn. The air outside was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sage. They were high above the desert now, on a narrow ledge overlooking miles of open land. Far below, the faint shapes of riders moved across the plain, still searching. Ruth sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the sight. "We're so high," she whispered. The Apache nodded. "The mountain gives us time. But they won't stop. Not until they find what they came for." Ruth turned to him. "Keep saying it's sacred, what they took. But what does it do? Why would men kill for it?" It was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It's not a thing of power. It's a memory. The feather belonged to a healer who could call the rain and calm the dying. When he was killed, his spirit bound itself to the land. The feather carries that connection. To some, it's a relic. To others, a curse. And to them," she asked, nodding toward the riders. "They think it will lead them to gold," he said bitterly. "They found an old map carved in one of our caves, part of a story they couldn't understand. The feather was drawn beside the mountain's mark. They believe it's a key." Ruth felt a chill settle over her. Men had always killed for less. The Apache looked out over the horizon, his blind eyes unseeing, but somehow aware. "They won't find what they're looking for. The mountain doesn't reveal its secrets to those who come for greed." Ruth watched him quietly. "Then why keep it? Why not destroy it so they'll stop?" "Because it's not mine to destroy," he said. "It belongs to the land, and the land remembers who honors it." Before she could reply, a sound echoed through the Kanona's sharp crack like thunder. Then another. A bullet struck the rock near their feet, sending splinters of stone flying. "They found us," Ruth gasped. The Apache didn't move. His head tilted slightly, listening.
"Oh,"
he said. "They found our shadow." Confused, Ruth looked down and saw that the morning sun had cast their silhouettes along the canyon wall, visible from below. "They're shooting at what they can see," he said, "not where we are." Still the shots grew closer. He turned toward a narrow path leading along the ridge. "We go this way quickly." The path was steep and narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Ruth followed closely, her heart hammering.
"Ow."
Each step sent small rocks tumbling into the abyss below. The baby pressed hard against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. Halfway along the path, a figure appeared at the other end, a man with a rifle slung across his shoulder, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Ruth froze. The man raised his gun slowly. The Apache stopped, his hand tightening on his bow. His blind eyes locked in the man's direction. "Get behind me," he said. Ruth obeyed, pressing against the wall. The man shouted something she couldn't make out. Then there was a flash of light, a gunshot, and the sound of stones shattering. The Apache loosed an arrow so fast she barely saw it move. The man cried out, stumbling backward, his gun clattering over the edge. He fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Ruth stared, stunned. "You hit him. But how could you?" He lowered his bow. "The wind told me where to aim." They moved past the wounded man quickly. Ruth looked back once and saw him trying to stand, blood darkening his sleeve. He shouted after them, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Can't run forever. You hear me? We'll find you both." But his words faded into the wind as they disappeared over the ridge. By midday, they reached a small plateau surrounded by stunted trees and dry grass. The Apache stopped near a circle of stones half buried in the ground. He touched one gently, bowing his head. "This is an old place," he said, "where my people prayed for rain. No one comes here anymore." Ruth looked around, uneasy. The land felt still, almost watchful. "Will we be safe here?" "For a time," he said. "But the land doesn't forget blood. They will come again." She sat down on one of the stones, exhaustion washing over her. "Then what happens when they do?" The Apache turned toward her, his blind eyes seeming to see right through her fear. "Then the mountain will ask us what we are willing to give in return." Ruth didn't understand what he meant, but his tone made her chest tighten. Somewhere far below, faint and distant, she heard the echo of gunfire again, proof that the hunt was far from over. The desert stretched endlessly around them, silent and unforgiving, and as the wind picked up once more, Ruth knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The wind had changed again. It carried a new scent, smoke and iron. Ruth smelled it before the Apache spoke, though his expression had already hardened. The air around the plateau was no longer silent. Even the dry grass seemed to tremble. Somewhere far below, horses cried out. The men were coming, and they were closer than ever. "They've split," the Apache said quietly. "Half took the canyon trail. The rest will circle behind us." Ruth felt the weight of the words press down on her chest. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, as if she could shield the child inside from what was coming. "Can we make it to the river?" she asked, her voice barely steady. He shook his head. "The river runs dry this time of year. They'd see our tracks long before we reached it. Then where?" He turned toward the mountain ridge, his blind eyes glinting faintly under the fading light. "There's one place left. But the land there doesn't welcome the living easily." Ruth wanted to ask what he meant, but the sound of gunfire cut her off. The echo rolled through the canyon, followed by shouting voices. Dust rose in the distance, where riders appeared like dark ghosts against the pale rock. The hunt had found them again. The Apache grabbed his bow, sliding it across his shoulder in one fluid motion. "We move now." They ran toward the ridge, their steps pounding against the dry earth. The sun was sinking low, painting everything in a deep red haze. Ruth could feel the baby pressing hard against her ribs, her breaths coming in sharp bursts. Each step sent pain shooting through her legs, but she didn't dare stop. The Apache moved ahead, guiding her by sound more than sight, every sense sharpened by instinct. Behind them, the riders' shouts grew louder. Bullets cracked against the rocks, one striking so close it threw sand into Ruth's face. She stumbled, but the Apache was there, steadying her with one strong arm. "Keep moving," he said. "The mountain is near." They reached the base of a jagged slope where ancient stone steps climbed upward, half buried by centuries of dust. The Apache took her hand, leading her carefully up the path. The climb was steep, the air thinner. The sounds of the pursuers echoed below, muffled by the wind. As they climbed higher, Ruth saw something strange through the rising dust, an old structure carved into the rock face. It wasn't large, but its dark doorway seemed to swallow the light. Symbols were etched above it, worn and faded, but still clear enough to recognize as something sacred. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The last refuge," the Apache said. "My people called it the mouth of the earth. It leads to the spirit ground." Ruth hesitated at the threshold. No, the air that came from inside was cold and damp, smelling of stone and something ancient. And you think they won't follow us in there? He turned his blind gaze toward her. If they do, the mountain will choose who leaves. They stepped inside. The light behind them dimmed, and the sound of the outside world faded. The walls of the passage glowed faintly, streaked with minerals that caught what little sunlight filtered through the cracks. It was eerily beautiful, but Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the place was alive, watching them. The Apache walked ahead, his hand tracing the carvings along the wall. "This is where our warriors came to speak with the spirits before battle," he said quietly. "They believed the mountain could show them the truth of their fate. And what does it show you?" she asked. "That all men return to the earth," he said. Ruth followed him deeper, her heart pounding. The baby moved again, stronger this time. She winced, but said nothing. The path narrowed, then opened into a wide cavern where a thin shaft of light poured through a hole in the ceiling, illuminating the center of the floor.
Ow.
In that light stood a single stone altar, smooth and ancient. The Apache stopped before it, bowing his head. "This is the heart," he said. "No further." Ruth looked around uneasy. "We can't stay here. They'll find us." He didn't move. "If we leave, we die. If we stay, we let the mountain decide." His calm frightened her more than the gunfire. She wanted to run, to find some other way out, but there was none. The only entrance was the one they'd come through, and already she could hear distant voices echoing through the tunnels. The Apache reached into his pouch and took out the feather. The faint light caught on its edges, making it shimmer like silver. He placed it on the altar and began to whisper in his language, words that rose and fell like the rhythm of the wind. The air in the cavern seemed to stir in response. Ruth backed away slightly, watching him. "What are you doing?" "I'm asking the spirits for passage," he said. "If they hear me, they will hide us." Before she could reply, the sound of boots and metal rang from the tunnel behind them. The hunters had reached the entrance. Ruth's heart raced as the light of their torches flickered against the walls. "There," a voice shouted. "In the chamber!" The Apache's chanting grew louder. The feather lifted slightly, as though caught in an invisible current. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Ruth grabbed the side of the altar to steady herself as the stone began to hum with a low vibration. "What's happening?" she gasped. "The mountain is waking," he said. Gunshots exploded through the air. The first bullet struck the wall, sparking against the stone. The men shouted as they poured into the chamber, their rifles raised. The Apache stood tall, his blind eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Step away from him," one of the men barked, "and hand over that feather." Ruth froze. She recognized the voice. It was the same man who had led the attack on the trading post, the one whose laughter had haunted her dreams ever since. His face came into the light, now rugged, sunburned, with eyes as sharp as the rifle in his hands. "You," she whispered. He grinned. "Well, look at that. The widow made it out alive. I'll be damned." His gaze flicked toward the Apache. "You've given us quite the chase, savage, but it ends here." The Apache didn't move. "You cannot take what the land does not offer," he said. The man laughed. "I can take anything I please." He lifted his rifle. Ruth's breath caught as the barrel gleamed in the light. But before he could fire, the ground split with a deafening crack. Dust filled the chamber as the walls trembled. Several men stumbled back, shouting. The Apache spread his arms wide, his voice rising in a final chant that echoed through the mountain. "Stop him," the man roared. One of the soldiers lunged forward, but a sudden gust of wind burst from the altar, hurling him backward into the wall. The others hesitated, their torches flickering wildly. The feather on the altar glowed brighter, spinning slowly in midair. Ruth crouched low, shielding her belly. The Apache turned his face upward toward the beam of light. "The land remembers," he said. The leader steadied himself and raised his gun again, firing directly at the Apache. The shot rang out, echoing through the cavern, but instead of falling, the Apache stood still. The bullet struck the altar, shattering part of the stone. The light dimmed, and the glow around the feather faded. For the first time, the Apache's calm cracked. His jaw tightened. "You have wounded it," he said quietly. "Now the land will take its due." The floor shifted again, harder this time. Cracks split the chamber, sending dust raining down from the ceiling. The men shouted, stumbling toward the exit, but the tunnel behind them began to collapse. The roar of falling rock filled the air. Ruth tried to crawl toward the Apache, but the ground buckled beneath her. He turned toward her, voice reaching out. "Stay near me," he said. "Do not run." The leader of the hunters scrambled toward them, his gun still in hand. "Give me the feather," shouted. "Give it to me and I'll spare you both." The Apache shook his head slowly. "It's not yours to hold." He lifted the feather again, pressing it to his chest. The air around him shimmered, and Ruth felt a strange pull, like the mountain itself was drawing them downward. The hunter fired again, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck near Ruth's shoulder, grazing the rock and sending fragments flying. She cried out, collapsing to the floor. The Apache turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky even though there were no clouds. The sound merged with the rumble of the mountain until the entire world seemed to shake. The hunter staggered to his feet, his face pale with terror. "What did you do?" he shouted. The Apache's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "I didn't do anything," the mountain remembers. A deep crack split the floor between them, the glow from the altar spilling through it like fire. Ruth felt the air grow hot and thick, her breath coming short. The Apache knelt beside her, helping her to stand. "We must go," he said. "Where?" she gasped. "Down," he said simply, "to where the spirits wait." The hunter screamed something behind them, but his voice was drowned by the roar of collapsing stone. The light from the altar grew brighter, wrapping around them both. Ruth felt her body lift slightly, the world spinning in blinding white. Then the sound of the mountain swallowed everything, gunfire, shouting, the beating of her heart, and they fell together into the heart of the earth, where the truth waited to be revealed. The world was dark when Ruth opened her eyes. The sound of her own breath was the first thing she noticed, then the steady drip of water somewhere nearby. For a long moment, she didn't move, unsure whether she was still in the mountain or buried beneath it. Her body ached all over, and her clothes were damp with dust and sweat. When she finally turned her head, she saw the faintest shimmer of light coming from a narrow opening above. The air was cooler, cleaner. She was alive. The Apache lay a few feet away, motionless. Ruth's heart leaped as she crawled toward him, her hands shaking. She pressed her fingers to his neck and felt a slow, steady pulse. Relief washed through her. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. He stirred slightly, his lips parting. "The mountain spared us." Ruth sat back, looking around. The chamber they had fallen into was unlike the one above. The walls glowed faintly with veins of silver and green, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and pine. As though the world above had seeped into this hidden place, a shallow pool of water rested at the center, its surface still as glass. Everything felt ancient, untouched, and quiet. "What happened?" she asked softly. "The land closed itself," the Apache said, pushing himself up. "The spirits chose to end the hunt." Ruth's thoughts drifted to the men who had followed them. She remembered their shouting, the gunfire, and the roar of collapsing stone. "Do you think any of them made it out?" He shook his head slowly. "Those who took what wasn't theirs will not walk the earth again." For a long moment, they both sat in silence. The air carried a strange peace, though. Ruth's heart still raced with the memory of fear. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling a faint movement. The child was still there, still strong. Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The Apache tilted his head slightly. "The child lives," he said quietly. She nodded. "Because of you." He smiled faintly. "Because of the mountain?" Ruth didn't argue. She didn't understand the ways of the spirits or the power he spoke of, but she couldn't deny that something had protected them. Maybe fate had led her here. Maybe it had always been leading her here. As hours passed, the light from the crack above began to grow stronger. It wasn't sunlight, not yet, but it gave her hope. She helped the Apache to his feet, steadying him as he leaned against the wall. His eyes were still covered. He moved with quiet assurance, guided by something beyond sight. "There's a way out," he said, his hand brushing along the stone.
"Oh."
"The water flows north. If we follow it, it will lead us back to the open world." They walked together along the shallow stream that wound through the cave. The path was narrow, the stones slick beneath their boots. Ruth's body screamed with fatigue, but she pushed forward, her mind fixed on the thought of sunlight. Every few steps, the Apache would pause, listening to the distant murmur of air through the cracks ahead. His calm steadied her. Finally, the tunnel widened again, and the sound of rushing water grew louder. A beam of daylight shone through a gap in the rocks, cutting across the darkness. Ruth blinked, her eyes stinging from the sudden brightness. "There," she breathed. "We're close." The Apache nodded. "Go first." With his help, she climbed toward the light, squeezing through the narrow opening until her hands met the warm air outside. When she pulled herself through, the world exploded into color. The mountains stretched out beneath her, the desert beyond, glowing under the soft light of dawn. For the first time in days, she felt the wind on her face. It was cool and alive, carrying the scent of sage and freedom. She turned back to help him through. He emerged slowly, his movements steady despite his blindness. When he stood beside her, the rising sun caught his face, painting it gold. "We made it," she said, her voice trembling. He tilted his head toward the horizon. "No, the land made it." They stood together in silence, watching as the sun climbed higher. The valley below was still and empty. No riders, no smoke, no sound of pursuit. For the next few days they moved carefully down the mountain, following the streams that led to open plains. Ruth's strength began to return, though her body was still frail. The Apache guided her by listening to the wind, the birds, and the way the ground shifted beneath their steps. He seemed to know where food could be found, where the water would be clear, and where it was safe to rest. At night, they camped beneath the stars. Ruth often found herself watching him as he sat by the fire, his face calm and unreadable. She wanted to ask him more about the spirits, about the feather, about what he had seen when the mountain awakened, but each time she stopped herself. Some things weren't meant to be spoken aloud. One night, as the fire burned low, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why did you help me? You didn't know me. Could have left me there." He turned his face toward the sound of her voice. "Because you carried life," he said simply. "And because the spirits said your path would meet mine. Do they still speak to you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not as they once did. "The mountain took part of me when it closed. My sight, my strength. But it also gave me peace." Ruth nodded slowly. "You lost so much." "So did you," he said. "Yet here you are, still walking." His words settled deep in her heart. In them, she found a kind of truth she hadn't known she needed. When they finally reached the edge of the desert, Ruth saw the faint smoke of a small settlement in the distance. It was a new town, nothing like the one she had lost, but it offered the promise of safety. The Apache stopped at the ridge, standing still, as though listening to something far away. "This is where your path continues," he said. She turned to him, panic flickering in her chest. "You're not coming with me?" He shook his head. "My place is with the land. It called me back, and now it keeps me." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know your name." He smiled faintly. "Names are for the living. The spirits know me without one." She wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but something in his calm expression stopped her. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "Then at least let me thank you." "You already have," he said softly. "You survived." He turned then, walking back toward the open desert.
Oh.
Ruth watched until his figure faded into the horizon, a lone shadow blending with the wind. She stood there for a long time, the weight of everything they had endured pressing on her. Then, taking a deep breath, she started down toward the settlement. The people there were kind. They gave her food, a place to rest, and a chance to begin again. Months passed, and the child was born a strong boy with eyes that seemed to hold the calm of the desert sky. She named him for the land that had spared them both, a quiet tribute to the mountain that still watched over her dreams. Sometimes when the wind blew from the east, Ruth thought she could hear a faint whisper carried with it, a voice speaking softly in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt it brought her peace, the kind that only comes after walking through fear and finding meaning on the other side. Years later, when her son was old enough to walk beside her, she took him to the ridge overlooking the mountain. The land had healed, though the scars of the old collapse were still visible. She told him the story of how the mountain had awakened, of the man who had seen without eyes, and of how courage can come from the most unexpected places. He listened quietly, his small hand wrapped around hers. "Do you think he's still out there?" he asked. Ruth smiled at the horizon. Yes, in the wind, in the stones, in the silence between heartbeats. The land remembers. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the desert glowed with the same deep light she remembered from that Datha, color of endings and beginnings. And for the first time, Ruth felt that everything, even the pain, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The Apache was gone, but his presence lingered in every rustle of grass and whisper of wind. His faith, his strength, and his quiet defiance against the cruelty of men lived on through her and the child she carried out of the mountain. And when the night finally came, Ruth looked up at the stars and smiled. The hunt was over. The land was at peace. And so was she.